The nations of the world are becoming more connected and interdependent. There are many benefits to be enjoyed as a result of globalization, but not all nations have benefited equally. There are vast differences in living standards and income levels around the world. While people in industrialized countries are generally living longer, more comfortable lives than ever before, in poorer countries, thousands of people die each year from easily preventable diseases like measles and malaria. There are a number of income and quality of life indicators that illustrate these differences. One of them is the United Nations Human Development Report.
The United Nations Development Programme has commissioned this study that has been produced every year since 1979, which basically gives a number of indicators with regards to each country's performance that particular year.
There are many variables that the UN Development Report takes into account.
The most important element probably would be the per capita income of an individual, and what is it that you are giving that person as a salary, and what is that person earning as a result of his or her work.
Economic growth and economic development are not the same thing. Economic growth refers to the increase in a nation's output or gross domestic product. It does not take into account changes in the population or the distribution of wealth. Economic development refers to improvements in the standard of living for the citizens of the country. Economic development is reflected in the criteria that the United Nations Human Development Report monitors: increased per capita income, life expectancy, literacy rates, and education for a country's citizens. Economic development is greatly assisted by investment in infrastructure, things like roads, dams, schools, hospitals, and ports. It is also often associated with changes from a rural-based agricultural society to an urban industrial-based society.
Unfortunately, ours is a world where you don't necessarily have an equality in each and every society. You have countries that are more developed than others. You have countries that are blessed with better natural conditions than others. You have a country that has been more educated than others. And as a result of all these variables, you have differences. And you have entire regions like Africa, for example, which suffer the results of this.
The United Nations Human Development Report takes three things into account: life expectancy, knowledge measured by literacy and enrollment rates, and gross domestic product per capita. From these statistics, it gives each nation a Human Development Index between 0 and 1. The higher the index, the greater the development in that country. The United Nations divides countries into three groups, based on their Human Development Index. High human development countries have an HDI of 0.8 or above. These countries have an average life expectancy of 77 years and a GDP per capita of just over $23,000 US. In the 2003 report, Australia had an HDI of 0.939. Medium human development countries have a human development index between 0.5 and 0.8. Their average life expectancy is 67 years, and their average GDP per capita is about $4,000 US. Low human development countries have HDIs lower than 0.5. Their average life expectancy is 49 years, and their average GDP per capita is about $1,200 US. 30 out of the 34 low development countries are in sub-Saharan Africa. In the 2003 report, Mozambique had an HDI of 0.356. There are many reasons why the level of development varies so much around the world. But in most cases, the main factors are health, education, and income, which is why the UN measures these factors. For example, many poor countries are dependent on agriculture for their income. Prices for agricultural goods are notoriously volatile, so a country's output, or GDP, and hence its income, can fluctuate wildly from year to year. A low income means that children often have to work to supplement the family's income, and there is little money available for health care. Inadequate health care and child labour mean that fewer children can attend school. Poor education leads to poor health and work practices, which in turn lead to low incomes. This is known as the cycle of poverty.
I was sorry about it, but if they didn't work, my salary would not have been enough. The children would have been walking around naked and barefoot.
Disease also plays a large part. HIV/AIDS now affects 20% of the population in South Africa. In Mozambique, 13% of the population have HIV/AIDS, and 18% have malaria. 800,000 people die from measles, a preventable disease, each year. Some poor countries are also affected by civil war, as well as the death, disease and destruction that war brings. Without a stable government, it becomes much harder to provide medical facilities and distribute food. Globalization has resulted in the economies of the world becoming more interdependent. What happens in one economy affects what happens in other economies. In Europe, 25 nations with different cultures and identities have come together to form the European Union.
Verifica elettronica sulla prima parte dell'emendamento 18.
Most countries now have market economies. Since the failure of communism in the late 1980s, many formerly communist countries have adopted market systems. They are having mixed success. The level of development in Russia and the Ukraine dropped between 1990 and 2001. China and Vietnam both improved. There are still vast differences in the quality of life between rich and poor nations. However, things are getting better for most people in the world, no matter how slowly. Between 1978 and 1998, average life expectancy improved. This was because fewer children were dying before their first birthday. Income levels have also increased in most places, but the income of people in rich countries has increased much more than the income of people in poor nations. Increasing globalization also means that transnational corporations will go wherever they can make the most profit. Usually, these are countries where wages and taxes are low. Although wages and conditions are inferior to those in highly developed countries, for many people there is no choice. They need the income that the work provides.
We're not talking about companies who cannot afford to pay workers a living wage. But the answer is not for these jobs to leave Mexico, because workers definitely do need them. The answer is for these jobs to respect workers' rights.
In Tijuana, Mexico, shanty towns have sprung up as people come to the city looking for work without enough money to pay for a home. This situation is repeated all over the world. On a larger scale, cheaper transport has resulted in mass migration, as people in poorer countries travel to richer countries looking for work and a better life. Globalization has been made possible by rapid economic growth and industrialization, which in some places has had a devastating effect on the natural environment. However, due to globalization, people around the world are also able to work together to solve these problems, or better still, prevent them from occurring in the first place. Governments, scientists and environmental activists from all over the world are working on solutions to environmental problems, such as the greenhouse effect and deforestation. The Republic of Ireland is a small and relatively young country. Since it gained its independence from the United Kingdom in 1922, its politicians have experimented with both protectionism and free trade. After the Great Depression of the 1930s, Ireland adopted an extremely protectionist policy. Irish entrepreneurs and firms were encouraged to replace imports. However, Ireland had a small population, 3 million, and a low standard of living. Firms and industries had few prospects for growth and development.
In the 1950s, we saw our population declining despite a high birth rate because so many people emigrated because they couldn't get jobs at a satisfactory wage level in Ireland. But it was difficult to do anything about that until we were offered the prospect of membership of the European Union.
This seems very good of the Netherlands, but it seems a very strange way to proceed.
Countries within the European Union have free trade policies with each other. But countries outside the EU, who want to trade with its member states, face protectionist barriers. Joining the EU meant that instead of having a market of 3 million people, firms in Ireland had a market of 300 million people. The Irish government also saw another opportunity. Because of the EU's protectionist barriers, firms outside the European Union who wanted to sell products inside the EU had to pay hefty tariffs. But if a firm made its goods in an EU member country, like Ireland, it didn't have to pay tariffs.
And what we did was we identified key sectors and said we're going to aggressively go after these, and we identified ICT, information communications technology sector, we identified the software sector, and we identified the healthcare and pharmaceutical sector. We went after the best and the biggest, the most profitable companies in those sectors, and we said we want you to be in Ireland. And that strategy was extremely successful and has resulted in us now having the top industries in all those sectors. Their European operations are largely based in Ireland.
Ireland was also appealing to foreign investors because it had a very low corporate tax rate.
If you consider that many European countries would have corporation tax rates of over 30%, ours was 10%. So therefore you can come here, you benefit from having to pay less tax. We also have a very good educated workforce. In the 60s, before this industrial development revolution, when Ireland had not a lot of resources, we decided to spend significant amount of money and put resources in place to service our educational needs and the needs of existing and future industries as we saw it. That has been probably one of the single best decisions Irish governments have made since its foundation of the state.
Most of the foreign direct investment that has fueled Ireland's boom has come from America. Ireland is especially attractive to American investors because it's the only country in the EU that both speaks English and has adopted the euro as its currency.
By the late 1980s and particularly the 1990s, the new policies really paid off in terms of an economic boom such as we had never seen before. We achieved very high growth rates of output, or gross domestic product, during the 1990s. And that translated into two important achievements. One was a rapid growth in the numbers at work in Ireland, which transformed the society as well as the economy. It eliminated or virtually eliminated the traditional Irish problem of high unemployment and the related problem of high emigration.
There have been 700,000 jobs added in the Irish economy from 1991 to 2001. 700,000 jobs in a country the size of 3.5 million. Much of that is primed by foreign direct investment.
The industrial sector was transformed from being a very traditional, small-scale type of industry to high-tech, glamorous industries in pharmaceuticals, electronics, and various medical technologies.
We're currently exporting over $110 billion, or American dollars, or euro. Of that figure, we have a $20 billion trade surplus in our favour. So clearly, if we're moving away from being just a small economy dependent on the UK as an export market, we have moved to being a global player, and we are the biggest exporter, for instance, of software in the world.
There are some disadvantages, however.
No longer having a separate currency, the Irish government and the Irish Central Bank has no influence over the exchange rate, no influence over monetary policy or interest rates. So in a sense, it's become like a state government in a federal system.
Also, the city of Dublin, Ireland's capital, has grown extremely quickly and faces the same problems as other cities which are transforming rapidly.
Much more urbanized, suffering from all the problems of an urbanized country, higher crime rates, congestion, higher house prices, frustration about commuting times. But a much higher standard of material welfare and well-being. If it was feasible to go back in time, I'm absolutely convinced that people would opt to stay where they are in the modern, prosperous Ireland, rather than going back to the insular, poverty-stricken, but quaint Ireland of my youth.